Ellie Cohanim, thanks for joining us on CBN News.
Chris, it's so wonderful to be with you and to be with CBN.
You were with the Trump administration. You worked on the Abraham Accords. How would you describe the Abraham Accords?
Chris, I was really privileged to serve in the Trump administration as Deputy Envoy to combat anti-Semitism, and I was part of the Abraham Accords War and Peace team. I would describe the Abraham Accords as a complete change of the Middle East, a sea change for the better, obviously, towards peace and peaceful coexistence between peoples. As you know, the Abraham Accords were war and peace normalization deals that the Trump administration brokered between the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and then eventually Morocco, Sudan, and Israel. And so the region dramatically has changed for the better because of the Accords.
Yeah, there's Israel has a peace treaty with Egypt and Jordan, but how would you say the difference is the peace treaty now with some of these Arab countries?
Well, in contrast to the Jordanian and Egyptian peace deals, which are, what we term kind of cold peace, which means that you're not seeing any kind of formal business-to-business ties. You're not seeing travel between the countries. And in contrast, the Abraham Accords peace deals, just today we saw the opening of the UAE diplomatic mission in Israel, which is so exciting. We saw the Israeli foreign minister go on his first trip to the United Arab Emirates and open the Israeli mission there as well. And so we're seeing the appointment of the ambassadors between these countries. And so warm, full diplomatic ties is also a huge contrast between these peace deals and Jordan and Egypt. And again, we're also seeing a lot of business to business and people to people activity. So for example, there was also an agricultural agreement that was just announced between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. And so what I'm observing is that there's just kind of a rush towards this peace and a rush towards wanting to have these ties between these countries. In my conversations, Chris, with diplomats and other leaders in the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, what they've told me is that they are really understanding the peace dividend. They know that it's in their national security and other country needs and interests. And so they are pursuing this peace because it just makes a lot of sense.
You were there in the UAE yourself. What did you see personally and that made you think that the Abraham Accords are something very special?
Chris, I'll never forget my travel to the United Arab Emirates, to Dubai and Abu Dhabi. I was there the Friday night and Shabbat of Hanukkah. And so there were 3 synagogue services that Friday night, one that I was invited to speak at. On Saturday night, there was this tremendously large Hanukkah candle lighting ceremony at the Burj Al Khalifa in Dubai, which I describe to people as the Times Square of the Middle East. So you have to imagine the scene. The Chabad of Dubai hosts a huge menorah candle lighting, a huge loud Jewish music concert. There's thousands of tourists walking around the Burj. And, to me, this is the new Middle East. This is the future of peace and, again, peaceful coexistence that's really the shining model we're seeing in the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. And I think the model really not only just for the Middle East, but truly for the world.
Yeah. And in light of that, the Biden administration has been in office now for several months. How do you think they are dealing with the Abraham Accords?
Chris, I'd like to see the Biden administration do more. Before the Trump administration left office, we heard announcements from President Trump, Jared Kushner, and others that there are other countries who, at the time, were open to making more peace deals with Israel. And unfortunately, since then, we haven't seen that happen. Within 120 days of the Biden administration, we also started to see the Hamas attacks on Israel with 4,000 rockets raining down on Israeli population centers and civilians where you are, Chris. And so this is not the kind of American leadership that I think most of us were looking for. I think that it's really incumbent upon the Biden administration to take these peace efforts and move them forward. There were, again, a number of countries that had signaled to the U.S. that they were open to the peace, and they're looking for the United States to show leadership and help them get there.
What about the Abraham Fund that was set up to help foster business? And as I've heard it described, a win-win. What about the Abraham Fund?
You know, Chris, the original Trump Peace to Prosperity plan was all kind of with this vision for the Middle East, for the Palestinians, for the neighbors of Israel, to infuse billions of dollars of investment, which would only obviously make everybody's lives improved and better. Now, the Palestinians wound up rejecting the Trump peace plan, and then we saw, fortunately, the Gulf Arab countries step forward and make the Abraham Accords peace deals instead. And I don't mean to say instead, but they were able to do that despite the Palestinian leadership not willing to make peace with Israel. And so today, with this Abraham Accord Investment Fund that you just said has been reported to have been basically, in essence, shut down by the Biden administration, it's a truly wasted opportunity. Obviously, this billions of dollars of investment into the region would only make the lives of Muslims, Jews, Christians, and really every citizen better.
Yeah, you're born in Iran, and how would you describe the role of Iran? It seems to cast a shadow on the Abraham Accords.
Well, I'll tell you something. I don't know that the Iranian regime is successful in casting a shadow, but as your audience knows, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad are proxies of the Iranian regime. They receive both dollars and training from Iran, and they, again, wage this this most latest round of attacks on Israel with these rocket fire, and they committed double war crimes in this latest round, which was that they shot at Israel from civilian areas, hoping that the Israelis would retaliate, which of course they must in self-defense, and therefore that Palestinian civilians would be killed. And then of course they, their attacks were aiming at Israeli civilians. So these are double war crimes that are being committed by Iranian proxies, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and others. And so I think Iran was trying as best as they could in this latest conflict to try to upend the Abraham Accords. But in fact, if it was a test of the Accords, I would say that the Abraham Accords came through in flying colors, because we did not see any cutting off of diplomatic relations. We did not see any fraying of the relationship between Israel and her Arab neighbors. In fact, as we just discussed earlier, we are seeing more and more developments happening every single day. And so I think ultimately the Iranian regime is on the losing side.
News just came out that a very well-known Iranian activist in the U.S., there was a report that Iranian agents wanted to kidnap her. Your reaction?
Well, you're referring to Masih Alinejad, Chris, and she is an outspoken fighter for Iranian human rights and for women's rights. Imagine in Iran that if a woman leaves the house without a hijab, she can be arrested, she can be imprisoned, and she can be tortured. This happens to women every day in Iran. And so Masih Alinejad is an Iranian woman who managed to escape Iran. She managed to make her way to the United States. She's a U.S. citizen. And yesterday we found this report from the Department of Justice that they have arrested 4 Iranian nationals in the United States of America on American soil who were trying to kidnap Masih Alinejad, take her back to Iran, and do God knows what. The Iranian regime has in the past lured Iranian expatriate journalists like Ruhollah Zam and others back to Iran, and they have tortured and dismembered them. And so I would assume this was the plan for Masih Alinejad. Chris, I have to tell you, this is the most flagrant operation by the Iranian regime, again, that they would dare try to do something like that on American soil. And I would really say that it's time for the Biden administration to consider this a red line and walk away from the Vienna talks. Why would the Biden administration trust a regime that just tried to kidnap an American citizen on American soil? How could the Biden administration trust them with a nuclear deal? It just makes no sense.
Yeah. You worked in the State Department. What's your reaction to their reaction to this possible kidnapping?
Chris, frankly, I was deeply disappointed. The State Department's statement on this attempted kidnapping was that it was a law enforcement matter, and they kind of passed the buck on to the Department of Justice. And I think that's honestly a shameful reaction. We need to see the Biden administration address the fact that this Iranian regime is not one that can be trusted, not trusted certainly with the lives of American citizens that we just saw at risk with what they planned for Masih Alinejad, and not trusted to be put on a pathway to nuclear weapons, which is what the Iran deal would do.
Ellie, you have a program called Global Perspectives. Final question, what's your perspective as you look at the Middle East going forward?
Chris, I am deeply optimistic because honestly, I believe that the good people of the Middle East will ultimately win. You know, I believe in the triumph of good over evil. The question is if we can get the powers that be in the United States and Europe to see the light as well, and for them to understand that when you're in a leadership position, you also have moral responsibility, and the moral responsibility would be to be on the side of peace, coexistence, bringing people of different faiths and ethnic groups together. That is what I hope that we'll see again from the US leadership and from European leadership.
Well, Ellie Cohanim, thanks for your perspective. Look forward to seeing you again.
Thanks for having me, Chris.